It's called What is Liberty? President Lincoln's Brave Idea. And my name is Michelle Martz. I work at this place called President Lincoln's Cottage. And I'll be honest, we are only 10 years old and not a lot of people have heard about us. And part of that reason is whenever we think of the presidents, we usually think of the White House, right? Because that's usually where presidents work and live. And while President Lincoln was president, he actually lived during the summers in this cottage that you see on your screen, which is only about 3 miles away from the White House, and he would commute by horseback or in carriage to the White House for work. All right, so I want to tell you a little bit of background information on the cottage before we move on. The cottage is on the grounds of a retirement home for veterans. So old soldiers lived here on the grounds, and they're actually the ones who invited President Lincoln to stay here at this cottage that you see on your screen. And one of the reasons why Lincoln came out to this cottage was because downtown DC was hot during the summers. It was swampy because of the Potomac River. It was a growth city. And then when you think about the White House, that's work. There's so many people that wanted to get to him, ask him questions. So by moving his family out here to the cottage, to the countryside of Washington, D.C., he was able to have some peace and quiet. And it really became this place where Lincoln could work and think on some really brave ideas. And one of his bravest ideas was actually the Emancipation Proclamation. And he worked on it here at this cottage. So what I want all of you guys to do is I want you to think to yourselves for just a moment. I want you to think about your favorite place you like to go when you're stressed. It's a place that you maybe feel safe to relax and to think. Maybe it's your bedroom, right, where you can close your door and get away from people. Maybe it's outside, like your favorite park, so you can get some fresh air. I want you to think about how this place makes you feel. Maybe your favorite place is quiet, or maybe it's a loud cafe surrounded by people. The feelings you have about your favorite place are similar to the way Lincoln felt about the cottage. He felt safe, it was quiet, and he was able to think so he could make the decisions that not only changed our country, but changed our world. So today I'm going to share some more history of President Lincoln's cottage and talk about Lincoln's ideas over liberty. But before we get into the lesson and discussion, I want you to have that piece of paper and pen out.
So use the back of the paper.
On your piece of paper, I want you to write your own definition of the word liberty. What does the word liberty mean to you? What comes to mind when you hear the word liberty? Do you picture something, someone, or someplace? Do you think an action or a description? So I'm going to give you just a few, probably about a minute, to write down whatever comes to mind about this word liberty and what it means to you. All right, just about 20 more seconds. Again, this is no wrong or right answer. This is exactly what liberty means to you. All right, I'm just going to move on. We're going to hold on to these definitions of liberty, our own ideas, and I'm going to refer back to them after a little while. All right, so I just pulled up an image on your screen. This is actually an image of a mural that we have in our museum. And I think that it's a really good teaching tool to understand what life was like at the cottage, or what we also call the soldier's home, because that's the retirement home for the veterans. So if you see on this image, the cottage is depicted, right? It's kind of the backside. It's the white building with the brown roof. That is where Lincoln lived. That castle next door was the building where the veterans stayed. Right? The veterans were mostly Irish and German immigrants, right? And they lived right next door to President Lincoln. And the whole grounds were their home. So I want to kind of zero in on the Lincoln up front. He's sitting next to the lady in pink. That's his wife, Mary Lincoln. He also has his son, Tad, who's with him. He's in a blue Union uniform, but I'll be honest with you, Tad was about 10 years old when they moved out to the cottage. He was not a soldier. And the reason why he has that uniform is because Tad became friends with all the Union soldiers who were there to protect Lincoln because of the Civil War. And I do have to tell you something sad about this place. One of the reasons why the Lincolns came out here, yes, was to get away from the White House in downtown DC. But they also lost their son, Willie. He died at the White House. And so they actually came here to the cottage so that they would have a chance to grieve and be sad as a family. And so one of the reasons why Tad became so close with these soldiers here is because they were like his new big brothers here at the cottage. So not only do you have veterans living here on these grounds, you have soldiers living here because of the Civil War. You have the Lincoln family, the first family living here, right? If you also look to the right, I'm trying to figure out what direction that is where you guys are. You see a cemetery off in the corner where the tree is? That was the first national cemetery. So if any of you have heard of Arlington Cemetery, that's where we bury our soldiers. This cemetery was opened before Arlington and actually filled up because of the Civil War. And that's why Arlington needed to open. So in this really unique way, this soldiers' home or the cottage brought Lincoln closer to the Civil War than the White House ever could. Because even though he was leaving the White House, he was surrounded again by Union soldiers, reminding him of the Civil War. He was living next door to veterans, reminding him the costs of the Civil War. Right? And then he also saw this cemetery, which was the consequences of the war. Right? So it gave him a really interesting perspective on what his responsibility was, not just as president, but as commander-in-chief. And this perspective was influenced by all the different ideas, right? Just looking at this one image, you see all of these different people that had their own ideas about maybe liberty and the Civil War. And that's very similar to us today, right? Lincoln was influenced by the different people around him with different perspectives. And I bet if you shared your definition of liberty that you just wrote with the people next to you, you might have different definitions, right? Some of you might have similar ones, but all of those different perspectives help us make decisions, right? And Lincoln really did need multiple perspectives when thinking about this idea of liberty. And so what I have planned for us today is I've taken one of Lincoln's speeches that is specifically about the word liberty, and I've broken it down into 5 different sections. And what I'm going to want to happen is I'm going to have a student from each class, we'll start with St. Dominic's first, to come up and read that section. I'll put the text up on the screen, and then we'll analyze what Lincoln was saying. And hopefully by the end of this speech, we'll kind of get a better idea of what Lincoln thought of the word liberty. Does that sound like a plan?
Yes.
Yes? All right. So St. Dominic's, I just chose you at random. Could I have a student come up? Oh, we already got one. Perfect. All right. And what's your name?
Myles.
Myles. All right. So this is the beginning of this speech. Lincoln said this to a group of people in Maryland. You've got the floor, Myles. Go ahead and start reading.
The world has never had a good definition of the word liberty. The American people just now are much in want of it. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing.
All right. Thanks, Myles. All right. So what Lincoln said to this group of people is that we don't have a very good definition of the word liberty. Now, liberty isn't a new idea for the American people, right? Remember, the Declaration of Independence tells us not only are all men created equal, but we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? But right now, during the Civil War, we are much in need of having a good definition of liberty that we can all live by. Right? So Lincoln continues. So Mr. Falk, could I have a student from your class read the next section?
Sure, Justin. Wait for it. Okay, nice and loud. Go ahead.
With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor.
Oh, great job. Thank you. And what was your name?
Justin.
Justin. Good job, Justin. All right, so Lincoln proposes that there's 2 definitions of liberty right now. All right? one definition of liberty is that me, myself, as one individual, I should get the benefits of my work, right? When I work, I should get the benefits. But there's a second definition of liberty that Lincoln brings up, and it's that I can actually get the benefits from someone else's work. I can take those benefits. And so one of those definitions is that individual freedom, and the other definition is about slavery, right? And as we know, the Civil War was an argument over what to do about slavery, right? So Lincoln proposes these two different definitions of liberty. And I want you to think to yourself, can these two definitions work together? And St. Dominic's, if I could have another student come up to read, because in the next section, Lincoln lets us know if these two liberties can work side by side.
Here are two, not only different, but incompatible things, called by the same name, liberty. And it follows that each of the things is, by the respective parties, called by two different and incompatible names, liberty and tyranny.
Yeah, and what's your name, sorry?
Frankie.
Frankie. Awesome job. All right, so this is what Lincoln says about these two liberties, that they're incompatible. And some of you are probably pretty smart and think the word incompatible is misspelled here. We took this right from Lincoln's own notes, and that's how he spelt it. But incompatible, they're opposites. You can't work together. You can't have individual freedom and slavery existing together. Right? And then what's really interesting, what Lincoln does next, is he jumps into a story, a parable or a fable about liberty and tyranny. And this is a literary device that Lincoln was really familiar with because one of his favorite books growing up was Aesop's Fables. And many of you probably already know this, but fables, they often teach us a moral or a lesson, right? So Mr. Falk's class, if I could have a volunteer read Lincoln's fable about liberty and tyranny.
She's coming. Okay. All right, here she is. Go ahead.
Oh, wonderful.
Shepherd.
Hi there, what's your name? Oh. Sorry, I interrupted you. I'm sorry, the delay. Sorry, what's your name real quick? Naomi. That's awesome. So can you go ahead and start reading and I won't interrupt you this time.
The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as the destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep was a black one.
Good job.
Hey, thank you so much. All right, so this fable that Lincoln is telling us about liberty and tyranny is about a wolf and a sheep. And when we think about it, this wolf is just, let's just think about them just plainly from the wolf and sheep perspective. We won't get into the meaning of these two animals. The wolf is hungry, and the wolf believes that the sheep is the only thing that he can eat and feel satisfied, right? And he believes it's his freedom to eat that said sheep. The black sheep, on the other hand, obviously does not want to be eaten. That simple, right? Nobody wants to be eating. And so the shepherd comes in and saves the black sheep, and the sheep thank the shepherd for his liberty. But the wolf, from his perspective, is that his liberty or his freedom was being taken away. I do need to point out that Lincoln made a color choice here. He made the sheep black on purpose. And that's because historically in American history, our slavery is built on racism. And so the meaning of the black sheep is that it's the enslaved people. African Americans living as enslaved. And his argument is they want to be free and they deserve freedom, this idea of liberty. Okay? And so Lincoln used this fable to talk to his audience about the differences between those two definitions of liberty that he proposed at the beginning. So for the very last section, I'd like St. Dominic's to come up and read the last part of Lincoln's speech. Dun-dun.
The sheep and the wolf are not agreed upon a definition of the word liberty, and precisely the same difference prevails today among us human creatures, even in the North, all professing to love liberty. Hence we behold the processes by which thousands are daily passing from under the yoke of bondage, held by some as the advance of liberty, to be willed by others as the destruction of all liberty.
All right, awesome. And what's your name real quick?
Kayla.
Kayla, that was a really good job. This was the hardest section. Right? Lincoln says a lot of things in here. So let's just kind of start from the beginning, right? Plainly, the sheep and the wolf are not agreed upon a definition of the word liberty, right? They have very two different points of view on these things. So Lincoln's arguing not they can be symbols for what these differences that he says prevails today among us humans. And then he has this little phrase in here, even in the North, and all professing to love liberty. And that's a part that I always look at when I read this speech. Even in the North and all professing to love liberty. So in your studies of the Civil War, talking about slavery, most of the slavery happened in the South, right? Or even in some of the Union states, which you call Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, or what we call border states, right? But there was slavery in the North at one point. But Lincoln's argument is that the issue of slavery was not the South's fault, but it's everyone's fault. Everyone in the United States will have to come together and work on a solution to this problem, right? And so when I think of this idea is that when Lincoln thought about slavery, he wasn't blaming anyone, but he was arguing that we all had to work together to figure out a solution. So now what I want all of us to do, now that we've gone through Lincoln's speech step by step and talked about his example of liberty and his different definitions and what he thinks should happen, I want you to revisit your definition of liberty on your piece of paper. And I want you to, now that we've gone through this with Abraham Lincoln, I want you to write maybe a new definition of liberty. Has it changed now that we've gone through the liberty tyranny speech together? Has it stayed the same? Take some time, I'll give you like a minute or two to think about maybe my definition needs more to it, or maybe it needs to change entirely. All right, I'll give you some time for that.
That was an interesting statement. But did you see she took a picture of the wolf with the shepherd and the black sheep? Was his game? Was it? Is that fair that the wolf had the sheep taken away? Right? But should the sheep have by the wolf? What's fair? Makes you think. You want to say about rob trade? Like taking from the rich, not really right to steal. That's right.
All right, I'll give you just about 30 more seconds, and then I want to share a story about Lincoln at the Cottage, discussing what this country meant to him.
You're good. We're good here.
You're good?
I know we're good.
All right. Is St. Dominic's good?
We are good.
All right, so hold on to those definitions because I want to share another story about Lincoln at the Cottage. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to try to unplug just so you guys can see my face again. And let me know if this works. Nope? Can you see me?
No.
No, we see a green.
We see you.
Yeah. Can you see me?
Yeah.
All right, good. I'm back in
I
your
see
classroom.
Saint-
Thanks so much.
I
All
see
right.
Saint. Oh, there we go. Yep, we see you now.
You see me?
Yes.
All right. So I want to share a story about Lincoln at the cottage to give you an idea of what life was like there. So after a long day of work, Lincoln went to the cottage to finally relax after making decisions and doing work at the White House. Probably he went to maybe work on some other things, but in the privacy of the cottage. And he didn't realize this, but a man named George Borett, he's from England, and I'll just call him Borett by his last name. He was traveling around. He wanted to see Niagara Falls, the big waterfall, and he also wanted to meet the President of the United States. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to Washington, D.C., but when you go to the White House today, there's a big fence and a lot of security guards out front, right? You can't just walk into the White House, knock on the front door, and say, "Hi, I'm here to meet the president," right? But in Lincoln's time, I have to let you guys in on something, you actually could. Right? Lincoln had a kind of an open door policy where people could line up all day long so they could talk to him about anything that bothered them. So Borett, thinking that was his plan, went to the White House to meet with the president. And unfortunately, he was not getting anywhere. I guess what he had to say wasn't that important. So finally, he found someone who said, "Oh, forget about the White House. We can go to his cottage. It's only 3 miles from here. We'll take a carriage and we'll be there to talk to the president." So on their way out there, they got lost. So it should have taken only about, tops 45 minutes, took much longer. And it was later on in the evening. They roll up to the cottage, knock on the front door, and the staff said, "No, it's past visiting hours. Mary Lincoln, the First Lady, she's already in bed, and President Lincoln's getting ready for bed, so it's not going to happen tonight." And that's when Borett and his friends got frustrated. They're like, no, see, you don't understand. We came all this way, we got lost, it's late, we're here to see the president. Which always makes me smile because I think of today, if I just walked up to the White House and said, "I'm here to see the president, let me in," they would probably escort me off the premises, right? For security reasons. But I don't know what happened that night at the cottage, but the staff led Borett and his friends into the cottage where they waited for the president. All right, so I want you to kind of think, all right, waiting for the president, how do you feel? Some people might feel anxious, right? What are you going to say to him? Other people might be checking their watches, be like, "Oh, the president's taking forever," right? Finally, Lincoln walked through these doors, and he had really sleepy eyes, messy hair, and his bedroom slippers on. And Borett thought to himself, that guy, that messy, sleepy guy, he's the president, the highest leader in this land. Because we have to remember, Borett's from England, and he had a queen, right? And I don't know much about queens, but I realize they don't probably show up to meetings in their pajamas. And Borett did admit, though, even though Lincoln looked like a mess, he made him feel at home at the cottage. And then all evening they talked. And what I find so special about their conversation is that Lincoln talked about his childhood, right? Growing up in Kentucky in the log cabin. His humble, poor beginnings where he didn't have a lot of school like you guys do, but he worked really hard, and that poor little boy ended up as President of the United States. And Lincoln said, that's what makes this country so great, that everyone should have the opportunity to be whatever they want to be when they grow up. All right, then we should have the right to rise, or sometimes in the world we call it the American dream. Right? But Lincoln thought really hard about that and realized that not everyone had that American dream. Right? We had about 4 million enslaved people living in this country. And so while he was president, not only did he have to save the Union and end the Civil War, but he also had to do something about slavery. So from the cottage, Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, which was one of the first major decisions to end slavery in this country. Right? So this was a military order that Lincoln freed the slaves in the South, right, to help end the war, but also to live up to that promise of freedom or liberty. And throughout this lesson, we've been talking about Lincoln's idea on liberty, but I've also asked you all to write your own definitions of liberty. And I'm wondering if I have maybe a student or two from each class who could share their definition of liberty and if it changed from the one before.
We're ready
I
if you're
see some
looking.
hands from Mr. Falk's group.
We have a volunteer at St. Dominic's.
Oh, St. Dom. Okay, then you go ahead first, our volunteer from St. Dominic's. And tell me your name real quick.
My name's Raphael.
Raphael. All right. So did your definition of liberty change?
Yes, it did a little bit actually. Started off
Yeah, it did? Cool.
liberty, the ability to choose for yourself and get work, but I ended up adding on a little bit more. The ability to choose for yourself and get the benefits of your work and yours only. Also the ability to be others see as differently as your opinion.
Oh, that's really good. So you added on to your idea of liberty, right? Why did you add on? Do you know why you added on?
I think it might have been the thing that Lincoln said about the black sheep and the wolf. The
Yeah.
wolf saw the farmer as like, hey, what are you doing? That's my food. The others,
Yeah, absolutely.
like, oh, thank God you saved me.
No, you're right? I sometimes when you have like those talking animals, they help understand this idea much better. So Raphael, thank you so much for sharing. I think I've got someone from Mr. Falk's class.
Okay, I've got Abra up here.
Abra, all right, tell me your definition of liberty.
My first definition was I picture that people of many nationalities in one place. My second definition was people of all nationalities are treated equal, but as we know, what's fair to us may not be fair to others.
Oh my gosh, that is so good. Can you tell me why you decided to change yours a little bit?
Because if the sheep didn't want to get eaten, he thought that getting eaten was not fair. If the wolf wanted to eat the sheep, he thought eating the sheep would be fair.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that definition of those were two really good definitions of liberty. I want to give some time for you guys to ask me questions about the cottage, but is there anybody else from either of the classes that want to share their definitions? Those are really good.
I think they'd rather, well, I'm good with asking you questions about the cottage because I know they got a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mr. Fox class, do you have a lot of questions?
Does somebody have a question about the cottage house? Whoa, you guys always have questions. You don't have any questions. Think about the questions. Okay, Fernando, nice and loud. Really loud.
Really big.
The size of the house itself? Like rooms in the house?
Yep, that is a great question. So, you know when you learn about Abraham Lincoln when you're younger and you talk about this log cabin that he grew up in? That log cabin was about one room big. The cottage here in Washington, D.C. it's about 10,000 square feet and it's about 30 rooms. So that cottage is so much bigger, right? And so I think a lot of people come to the cottage and they show up and they go, excuse me, that doesn't look like a cottage to me. It looks like a mansion. And the reason for that is the man who built the cottage was not Abraham Lincoln. It was a wealthy banker. And so the wealthy banker maybe defined a cottage as a big mansion. But I don't know if Abraham Lincoln, who came from that log cabin, would say so. So yeah, the cottage is really big. Absolutely. That's a good question. Kind of gives you that idea.
Can I do another one?
Yeah, and then we'll move on to St. Dominic's and see if they have
Okay,
any
I
questions.
don't want to hug. Tusky, nice and loud.
I'm going to interrupt real quick because we have to end class right now, but we really appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, great. Thanks, St. Dominic. Awesome definitions. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. We look forward to another one. Thanks.
Bye, guys.
No, you're not waving goodbye. So I still have time, though. Can I use some more time?
Mr. Falk, you can use the time.
Okay. Tusky, nice and loud. Loud. His son. They're curious about his son.
Yeah. Can I tell you a little bit about his whole family to give you a better idea of what his family life was like?
Absolutely.
So he had his wife, Mary Lincoln, and they actually, and some of this story is going to get sad, so I want to prepare you for that. They had 4 sons. They had their eldest son, Robert, He came to the cottage sometimes, but he was often busy at college. He went to Harvard. So he'd have to visit, when he was out of school. They had a son, Eddie, their second son. He actually died when Lincoln was living in Illinois before he was president. He got sick and just never recovered. Their son, Willie, did go. I mentioned him briefly when I was talking about that mural, the image of the soldier's home. And Willie passed away of what we call typhoid fever. And that was from the drinking water in downtown DC because it didn't have clean water at the time of the Civil War. And Willie got sick, and he never recovered. And that death was really broke up the family. The family was brokenhearted about it. And that's one of the reasons why they had to go to the cottage. And they brought their youngest son, Tad, with them. Tad, was always doing fun things around the cottage. He had a pet goat that would sleep in his bed with him, which is kind of obnoxious. My mom would never let me have a goat in the house. Tad, later on, didn't live very long either. He lived till he was 16. So President Lincoln only had one son that lived to adulthood, which is extremely sad. All right, so does that kind of make sense, their whole family, these 4 boys growing up together?
Okay, we can do another question?
Go for it. I've got time.
All right, Michelle, nice and loud.
Oh, Michelle.
How much what?
How much worth is Abraham Lincoln?
Oh, okay. Well, so today the cottage, is it owned by the government or is it a private foundation that owns the cottage?
Great question. We are a private organization. We're called a private nonprofit. So the government doesn't own the cottage.
My student was just curious if someone were today to try and buy that house, it would probably be it's in Washington, D.C. That's what we're remembering. It's 3 miles from the White House. So that's around that cottage right now. So is it residential houses around the cottage right now?
Yeah, to kind of give you an idea of the neighborhood. So the retirement home for veterans, you guys, is still there. So there's still a home for veterans. So we have tons of green space in DC, even though DC is this big city. So right there by the grounds is nice and green and looks like the retirement home. Right outside the gates is a residential part of Washington, DC. Lots of houses, there's a school down the road, but I will let you know that we are a national monument. And to be a national monument, a president has to sign that to say that you are protected no matter what happens. And so President Clinton actually signed us as a national monument. But we are run privately. So it actually can be kind of confusing. So I'm glad you asked that question. But don't worry, no one's going to buy the cottage and use it as their own home or anything like that. We're going to keep it for President Lincoln.
Well, all my students think that they're going to graduate high school, graduate college, be millionaires one day, and then look for a nice house to live in. So they're always looking for a nice house.
Oh, Mr. Falk, I totally understand. You want to live in a house with 36 rooms or something like that?
Right.
Yeah, I see some head shaking. Well, you can't buy the cottage, but there are some other houses in DC that you can buy. Sound like a plan?
Yeah. How would Lincoln go back and forth? Would he be on a horse or would he be in a carriage? And then how much time on average was he at one house compared to the other house?
Yeah, so today in DC, we joke a lot because we have a lot of traffic, lots of cars on the road, lots of people here. And to get to the White House today through traffic could take anywhere from like 45 minutes to an hour or 20 minutes. Lincoln on horseback could do it in 35 because there was no traffic. There was nobody on the roads. So his commute wasn't so bad as most people's here in DC. And that's just because we have so much traffic. But that commute, when you're kind of thinking about it, sometimes Lincoln would go with his security guards, to protect him. There would be guards on horseback riding with him through the city. But sometimes Lincoln would wake up early and leave without them. So I want to ask you guys, why do you think Lincoln would leave without his security detail, even though it was dangerous? Why go by himself, do you think?
Whoa, that's a good question. Go ahead, nice and loud, Fernando. He what? Go ahead, Five.
Because he wanted to learn how to himself without people like being overprotective.
Could you hear that okay?
Mr. Falk, can you just repeat a little bit? I think I got most of it.
So what he was saying was that Lincoln enjoyed that alone time, meaning like, your commute by yourself gave you time to think.
That is absolutely correct, right? He just likes some alone time to think. And when you're president, people are surrounding you all the time, right? And that just gave him that 35 minutes maybe in the morning to think and be alone. I think that's a really beautiful idea. I love that.
Okay. Also,
I've got more time.
Do you have more time? You tell me.
I've got like 10 minutes.
Okay, good. And I have 15 minutes, so we'll go 10 minutes.
Okay,
We spent some time learning about the assassination of Lincoln. They were kind of fascinated by John Wilkes Booth, and we got some history in class about John Wilkes Booth. So that day and that week of his assassination, he would have been living at the Cottage House and the White House at the same time that this assassination went down.
Yeah, Mr. Falk, I really love that. So as you guys are thinking about the assassination, Lincoln's last visit to the Cottage was the day before his assassination. He actually rode out to the Cottage to what we think is that he was going to check it out to see about his next move out there for the summer. Right? Unfortunately, right, we know what happened, right? The next day he was assassinated. Right? And so unfortunately Lincoln didn't get to have his last summer at the Cottage, but that's something that we argue is that, well, maybe that means that the Cottage now stays open for all of us. And we did this really cool thing, and I've got some video of it, so Mr. Falk, maybe I can send it to you. But for the 150th anniversary, on that very day, that day before his assassination, we took horses from the White House and we rode through the streets of Washington, D.C. alongside cars all the way to President Lincoln's cottage to commemorate that commute that he made, and specifically his last ride to the cottage. So we were a little crazy to put horses on the street, but it was a beautiful ceremony. And so, Mr. Falk, I'll try to find a video of that and send it to you.
So then how long after the assassination did his family stay did his wife and son stay at that house then for years after that?
No, they didn't. Actually, Mary Lincoln was so distraught with what happened, she stayed at the White House for a few weeks, and then she moved on. She moved to a few different places. She lived with her oldest son, Robert, for a period of time, and lived with her sister as well. But no, unfortunately, they were not able to go back to the cottage. I think, the same reason why they had to leave the White House because Willie died, I think the cottage might have had some of those same feelings too. And Mary Lincoln really needed to... She was so distraught, and again, she stayed in the White House after Johnson was next, into his presidency. They did not come back.
My class found very interesting that we had seen a photo of where there was a rooming house or boarding house where John Wilkes Booth and maybe some of his conspirator people were, and now it's a Chinese food restaurant. So
yes, it is. It's called the Walk and Roll.
So has the cottage gone through a history at all where at one point it was anything else, or has it been preserved ever since?
Yeah, so because it was on the grounds of the retirement home used it for a variety of things. So they used it as office space. They used it for the first female veterans dormitory, right? Women not always fought for the military. And so when we got there, it was used as office space. And so what we were able to do was to take out all that office space stuff, the carpeting and things like that, and restore it back to Lincoln's time period. But no Chinese restaurant has moved into the cottage.
They did find that very interesting. They do have.
It's great.
Yeah. Michelle, nice and loud.
So, is it true that when Abraham Lincoln died, he had a journal and he wrote that he had nightmares about he getting assassinated?
Could you hear that?
It got just a little jumbled. Could you repeat that for me, or the gist of it?
We had learned that Lincoln had written in a journal that he had dreams about him being assassinated. And she was just curious, since we have an expert like you on the computer right now, how much truth or what kind of description, what do you know about that?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, Lincoln didn't keep us a journal. Lincoln historians like myself would love that, to get a little bit more in depth from him, but there are recordings of him having dreams about his assassination. And so there's a dream that he had where he was at the White House and he came down the steps and there was a funeral going on, and he asked someone there, whose funeral is this for? And they said, well, for the president. And there's another dream that he had during the Civil War, and it was him on a boat, and the stormy seas were about, and he was having a really hard time finding the coast. And as he was steering the ship, he kept going back and forth trying to find the coast, and he finally did. And so those streams of that stormy sea always showed up during battle time. And so I think those are stress dreams. Sometimes when we get really stressed, they can come into our dreams. So he had that dream is well documented, and so is the one of his going to his own funeral. That's a really good question.
I found it interesting that they found that interesting. That was pretty neat.
Right.
Naomi, nice and loud, Naomi. Okay. Anthony, come closer so that way, right there is good. I think there, nice and loud.
Did Robert actually said that Mary was crazy after Lincoln died?
Robert, what do we?
Robert, the oldest son, the one that
The
was
oldest son.
But the oldest son.
I've heard that he locked her in
His mother. The relationship between the oldest son and his mom after the assassination.
He locked her in the hospital and said that she was crazy.
So what was Mary's? You mentioned a little bit how distraught she was afterwards. How was she socially? Like you said, after that, there were stories about how she was so upset afterwards.
Yeah. So Mary Lincoln, after the assassination, she was really emotional and distraught. Like I said, she kind of locked herself in the White House for a few weeks afterwards. And Robert and her, as he became an adult, had trouble getting along, which, as you all get older, we always have trouble getting along with our parents as we become adults. And it's been said that Robert and Mary had very similar personalities, and sometimes when you're too similar, it's hard to get along. And he did send Mary to what we call an asylum. Now, it's very different from what we think today. It was actually more like a country house that she had the freedom to come and go as she wanted. So I kind of more see it as, sometimes we send our grandparents to retirement homes and things like that. It was much more like that. But she did have some trouble coping. And that happens a lot, right, with mental health, that sometimes people get too stressed, and we have things like depression, right? And scholars have said that they do believe that Mary had some sort of depression from witnessing her husband die right there in front of her, and to losing so many children as well. So we can definitely see how that could have had an effect on her and for the rest of her life. So that's a good question to kind of pull apart.
I wasn't going to go too much into we had to focus on knowing what the word assassination meant as a vocabulary word. But I didn't think that we would go so far into it as we did, but they were very interested in that after part too. And, because thinking about that, could it, just the idea of an assassination of a president today is kind of hard to think about, when back then there was not as much protection, and how protected the president is today, and how a country would react to something like that happening. They were pretty interested in that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And because it seems so strange, right? And, here in DC, you guys, whenever the president has to go somewhere, we shut down roads, and there's multiple cars, and there's sirens, and we do our best to keep them safe. And so it was definitely a different time for Abraham Lincoln. Absolutely. So I can tell why you guys are so fascinated.
Yeah. I'm watching the time too. So this is right around the time we should wrap this up for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was very good. You were right on point with this age group. Like these guys understood every word, the fable was very good. Like everything, the speech that you shared with them was very much, they understood all of that very well, which was really nice. I appreciate that.
Oh, Mr. Falk, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. I love that speech so much because I think it gives us a lot to think about. And so I really enjoyed my time with your class. And hopefully I can get some of your contact information. So if you have any other questions about the cottage, or I can send you that video and maybe some other lesson plans from the cottage in Lincoln, I can get that to you.
Yeah, because you know what's going to happen? We're going to end this, and then they're going to ask me 50 questions. So if I have more questions.
Yeah, exactly. Write them down, and I'll make sure that through this program you'll get my contact info. Okay?
Yes. Okay. All right, everybody, what do you say?
Bye, guys. Thanks so much.